In the late 1960s, French Marxist Guy Debord wrote The Society of the Spectacle. If you've read it, you'll probably agree that it is incredibly relevant to today. This is a good testament to its prescience, but it's also a bad sign that the phenomenon he identified as a problem is only accelerating. For this presentation, I'll describe his theory about the Society of the Spectacle. I think the relevance to today's media landscape, particularly with social media, will be quite obvious, but I think it can also help us understand the way identity is constructed today within that landscape, how that has changed over time and why, the implications this has on our experiences of ourselves, our relationships with others, and even, I think, the effectiveness of the social movements and political projects that exist revolving around these. The book is read as a list of hundreds of theses, and the first one says, everything that was directly lived has receded into a representation. What does he mean by this? Very generally and briefly, we can look at the history of economic production as shifting from providing what was needed, pre-agriculture, to modern-day consumer-driven production, which far surpasses what we need to survive. This requires the manufacturing of endless desires and finding new things to sell, which once physical needs have been taken care of, start to become increasingly abstract. Debord described this as a shift, a decline even, of being into having, where we no longer gain fulfillment from who we are or what we do, but from what we have, and then from having to merely appearing, where what we have derives its purpose from appearances and perceptions. So knowing that, what is the spectacle? Well, the spectacle uses the image to convey to people what they must have. In that sense, the spectacle is the logical next step in the progression of capitalism. Capitalism requires infinite economic growth, which requires the continuous expansion of markets, which requires commodifying everything, including human interaction. For example, capitalism commodified labor. This is something we now take for granted, that we sell our labor in the marketplace as though it were a product with a dollar value. So Debord conceptualized the spectacle as the latest manifestation of the market colonizing human activity. At one point it was labor. In his time, it was increasingly social life and communication. In the 1960s, this was predominantly manifested in the form of TV, news, advertising, entertainment, celebrity. It's important to note that the spectacle is not these images themselves, it is the social relation between people mediated by these images. These images then come to replace genuine human interaction and meaningful activity. They become the medium through which we experience life and relate to one another. 40 years later, today's media landscape is basically the spectacle on crack, whether it's social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, or other forms of internet content like YouTube, Netflix documentaries, your newsfeed on your phone, podcasts, listicles, 10 ways to lose 5 pounds now, or 5 times your political opponent got totally owned. Now, social media and the internet were supposed to democratize information and communication. With its introduction into the mainstream, we were no longer just passive consumers of information and images, but now the barrier to entry was very low to producing these images ourselves, to contributing information. Or even if you're just a consumer in all this and not contributing, you have more choice of what content to consume, or so it seems. The bittersweet nature of this shift in our relationship between production and consumption parallels what happened after industrialization. Debord says the ruling classes realized that workers needed to be given time off work to be consumers so that they would have time to buy the products they were manufacturing. So the working classes came to become both producers and more fully involved consumers. So while workers were given more leisure time, this was permitted because it could be channeled towards buying things. That time off was still serving capital. In the same way, the spectacle today turns us into simultaneous producers and consumers. We're constantly buying and selling now. And by buying, I mean clicking, viewing, sharing, even just browsing Instagram, you're still participating. Someone's making money off that. And by selling, I mean not just selling content or ad space, but also just posting, contributing content. In a way, we're selling ourselves on these platforms. They're how we prove we exist to the world. Or for writing content, we may not be marketing our ideas for profit, but often we're doing it for social recognition or reputation. So what does all this have to do with identity? To expand, the spectacle needs to be fed, so everyone needs to be incentivized to constantly contribute and consume. Things that everyone can reasonably contribute, and very frequently, are everyday individual experiences, opinions, feelings, images. So the spectacle becomes a constant stream and part of these coming at us in easily digestible fragments. On the consumption side, the simpler the narrative, the better for people to want to look at it, the image or the text, and then to be able to quickly move on to the next thing. One relatively frictionless frame within which to organize these bits and bytes of data about people's thoughts and lives is through the lens of identity. So it could be social identity, like gender, sexual orientation, culture. Could be a political identity, like your political affiliation or mental health status, or even musical or artistic subculture, profession, etc. It's already well understood how identity politics were harnessed by corporations as countercultural subcultures to sell products to through lifestyle branding. And that's certainly still happening and is only accelerated on social media through ads, as they can target demographics based on identity with ever eerier accuracy. But more than turning it into an advertising niche, the logical conclusion is that identity itself becomes commodified and increasingly functions as a product to be consumed or sold. It no longer just helps build brands, it is a brand at the personal level, and it is the frame through which we relate to one another and understand issues. Your identity, your experiences, maybe your suffering, or someone else's can be used to sell content, books, podcasts, websites, or even just posts or tweets. And then can be used to sell yourself as an influencer, content creator, blogger, consultant, academic, activist. The result is that market logic infects the experience of identity. What is deemed a valuable expression of or experience of one's identity is determined by what gets likes, shares, and clicks. Value is determined by visibility. In Thesis 69, Debord says the objects that promise uniqueness can be offered up for mass consumption only if they have been mass-produced. So anything subversive or radical will only succeed if it can be mass-produced and mass-consumed. So only manifestations of and appeals to identity that do not threaten actual power structures will ultimately survive. The spectacle reduces and interprets the world for us. What we see on these platforms becomes our reality. As only increasingly diminutive experiences are capable of being commodified, we come to understand these as solely or mainly constituting our identities. Identity becomes reduced to that which can fit in a tagline or be quickly ascertained in an image. All complexity is removed, and this severely constrains our understanding of our identities and any related issues. In turning identity into a series of appearances and perceptions, the spectacle severs experiences of and understanding of identity from the material, so our needs, our environment, what we do. With gender, for example, gender roles, for all their faults, were based on divisions of labor, which were tied to producing for the community and some sort of perception, rightly or wrongly, of the collective good. Now gender functions more as an individual identity, which is determined by one's private thoughts and feelings, how someone expresses themselves based on what they purchase, often. This focus on appearances mystifies class relations and power dynamics. It means discourses become dominated by relatively superficial concerns, so like a lot of microaggressions, maybe language policing, issues of expression, corporate-friendly diversity inclusion campaigns, which avoid political and economic factors, absconding deeper structural issues. The spectacle also separates identity from the relational. Identity was once constructed according to our place in our community and relative to our social relation to others. Now even our social identities are constructed in isolation. We connect to one another primarily through appearances and perceptions negotiated by the spectacle. Neoliberalism has displaced all community bonds, but this is a deeply human need, so we continue to seek fulfillment of that sense of community and connection through the only means we have available, through the spectacle, but we can never be satisfied by it. While the spectacle generates more social identities and makes it seem like we have more freedom than ever before, that we have more of a voice, more avenues to express ourselves, this is akin to the freedom we have to buy different products as Westerners, like 5 different types of ketchup or whatever. There's more choice technically, but it's not a meaningful choice. It's completely immaterial, it separates us from others, and it doesn't actually challenge any of the structures that govern us or control us. The spectacle's function in all this is to distract and pacify us while it perpetuates itself. Overall, the spectacle creates identity formation and understanding of ourselves, which is directly at odds with our well-being, with any potential solidarity, and therefore precludes the possibility of meaningful change, I think. And it does this in a way that superficially addresses our need for a sense of identity and community, but really continues to rob them from us. Thank you.